Well, hello everyone. Hope everyone's doing well today. Our topic at hand is Love at First Sight with PowerApps and Flow. I know it's Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day to everybody, and I hope you and your people and your software products are all in very good sync with one another. Now, what we wanted to do in today's session is we want to just have a introduction to PowerApps and Flow. You know, for those of you who have not used it so far, if you play around with the tutorials, you know, hopefully there'll be some tidbits here and some, high-level guidance on how to use these two services. As we get, towards the end, we'll look at things like connecting with SharePoint Online, using Microsoft Flow to extend to PowerApps, and then we'll look at a couple of advanced topics. You know, we're not going to get into super advanced stuff, but once again, we're trying to see the surface area of what PowerApps and Flow can do for our organizations. Now, it's important to see where Flow and PowerApps are getting their marching orders. So, Critical Path has been very involved with Power BI for several years at this point, and what's important to see is that the same team that creates Power BI is also the team that creates Flow and PowerApps. It's not the Office team. So it's really the data platform that's creating, these services that we're going to look at. And what you'll see is that there will continue to be more and more synergy between Flow, PowerApps, and Power BI, but also just because of the way that connectors work, there's great connectivity and integration between PowerApps and Flow and some of the other things you might already use, like SharePoint, Outlook, Azure Active Directory. Now, when you kind of have a need to describe what is PowerApps at a high level, well, it's a service that runs in the cloud, so it's something that you need a license for, whether you're going to be building things with PowerApps or whether you're consuming things. So it's a service that is licensable on a per user basis. There's nothing about PowerApps that really caters to the anonymous user. Now, it's all about having people that don't have to be professional developers, what Microsoft will call the citizen developer, what we might call a power user. And it's all about building apps that can reach any browser. So I don't care if you are a Windows user that likes IE or you work on the Mac and you use Safari. I want to be able to reach you with what I build. And also, we want this to be able to run on mobile devices and tablets. I want my app to be able to run on your iPhone or your iPad. Now, what you're going to see is that everything that we do with PowerApps and Flow goes through this connector model, so we can connect to data sources, and most of what we do as we put together the user interface experience, doesn't really matter whether we're going to SharePoint or SQL Server or an Excel workbook. So the idea of the connector is you bring in the data, and then it's kind of all normalized to a standard convention of how you treat data inside the user interface experience. Now, there is the PowerApps Studio interface. So what you need to do is you need to get a license. Let me go ahead and I'm going to move back and I'm going to go ahead and move into a PowerApps screen here. And I should have done this before we started. I'm going to clean my screen up a little bit so I don't quite have so many windows open inside here. Now, the idea is when we're working with PowerApps, I can take a Power App that someone else has built, and I can go ahead and start it up. For instance, let's say someone else built this device ordering demo, and I go ahead and start this app inside here. This is one of the apps that we build in our 2-day PowerApps and Flow training courses. And the idea is that someone's trying to order a device within their company, so they can look at different manufacturers, and find, different types of devices. Maybe we go down to Toshiba. I like that one as well. We'll now go ahead and compare the different items. So you're kind of building out a user interface experience, in this case, so someone can quickly look between the different laptops that they might want, And now let's say that at this point, we'll go ahead and, Ted Pattison is going to be the approver. We'll put in some comments. We'll go ahead and submit the request, and off. Basically, we've saved something up into SharePoint or SQL Server. Okay, now let's go ahead and get back to where I was before. It's just an example of using one of these. Now, what I'm going to do is just get an app up and running. and I'm going to start with it just as vanilla an app as you can do. Now note that at present I'm at web.powerapps.com. So there's web.powerapps.com and create.powerapps.com. Now I'm going to say create an app. So back over here, I'll click on the create an app button, and now you're at create.powerapps.com. So there's this idea that, are you a consumer or are you a builder? If you're a builder, you basically spend time at create.powerapps.com. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a blank app here. Notice that I can either pick phone layout or tablet layout. I'll pick phone layout, and we'll create this brand new app. So what we have is something that doesn't have much going on. It has a single screen. Now, just to kind of get up and going, I want to have two screens, and I want to navigate back and forth between the two different screens. So that's a basic concept that we have to understand. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a second screen. Now we have screen 1 and screen 2. Now for screen 1, I'm going to go ahead and change the color to something a little bit prettier. We'll go ahead and change that one to red. We'll go ahead and we'll take screen 2 and I'll change that one to blue. So now I can kind of go back and forth in the design environment. So let's say that I go to screen 1. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to add a command button that someone can push on that will then navigate them to page 2. So we'll go to insert. I'll go ahead and I'll add a button inside here. And there's my button. And so we'll just have something like go to page 2. And so what you'll see is that there is this formula bar. And different things, whether they're a screen, whether they're a control, what we're about to see, forms, when you select one of these, notice that you can see different properties that you can set. So there's this one property, it's really kind of an event handler called onSelect. And so what we need to do, and so I'm going to start typing navigate. Note that down below that there is an IntelliSense that kicks in. This will take you some time to get because people hit navigate or tab or enter, and it just takes a little bit of time. But I'm going to go ahead and click on the tab key. I pick navigate. Notice that it's kind of telling me which of the two screens. I want to go to screen 2. And then also there is this transition. So when I go there, maybe I want to have a fade or I want to have a cover. Okay, great. Now let's go to screen 2. And on screen 2, let's put another button. And so here, what we're going to do is we're going to basically use another function for navigation, which is called back. And once again, when I call back, if I want to go ahead and put some kind of transition fade inside there. Okay, so arguably, I haven't done very much. I've created two different screens. Each one has a button. But after I've been building my app, I want to go ahead and test it out. So what you can see is up here in the upper right, there's a little play button. I go ahead and play that, and now it kind of simulates, what would happen, as this user is working. And you can see that Ted has some mistakes already because I have to start at screen 1. So whatever the active screen is the screen that you will get to. So here, go to page 2. There I go to page 2. Now I have a back command, and I can kind of go back and forth. Great. You kind of saw there's an issue. If I start at screen 2, and then I click the back button, or I click a button with a back command inside there, it doesn't really work because you weren't at a form first. So quite often when we work with Power Apps, we have something where you get to a screen that has all the data, you select one record, and then you basically get to a form that shows you detail on one, and so you'll use the back button. Here, if I wanted to, make sure that I was going to the right place, I could switch it from back to navigate, and then where do we want to navigate to? Let's hard code the screen name in, which is going to be screen 1. Okay. One of the things that I really had to get out of the habit is when I'm done with the formula, hitting the enter key. So you just kind of type in the formula, then I kind of just sit back and let it enter itself inside there. But now we'll go ahead and run the app one more time, and what we could see is, we can basically navigate from page to page. Okay. Now, one of the biggest things that the Power Apps team will say is that we created this product because it's for power users, not developers, to seem more like Office products. So, for instance, it kind of seems like PowerPoint. You're kind of starting a slideshow. If you can kind of start up and kind of move from one screen to another. And there's also a lot of things that are like Excel. So, as an example, let's say that I have a text box, and I want to allow the user to type inside of this particular text box. Now, there is a default property. So I'll do something like type in Bob's your uncle inside here. And what you can see is that you can set property values like a text box default property. I can set it up here in the formula bar. Note that I can also set it over here in the property pane. It's your choice. If you don't want to write formulas, use the property pane, but quite often you're going to be writing formulas. Here's an example. Let's say that whatever we have inside here, we'd like to go ahead and mirror somewhere else. So here I'll create a label, and I'll put the label down here. And so instead of having the text property be hard-coded, I'll now take that text control, and you can see over here on the left-hand side, you can see what the name of it is. So it is text input 1 dot text. And so as soon as we do that inside there, and we've got it set to text, and finally I get that put inside there, what we can see here is it's giving me the same. And so if I come in here and I type, this is more data, you can kind of see that things are keeping in sync. So one of the big things about working with Power Apps is you don't write code to go to that text box over there and assign the text value. Instead, controls know what their own property values are. So you go to a property of the item that's going to be updating, and you basically put a formula inside there. So the idea is that state just changes, and your controls react to the changes in state, which is very different than some other things inside there. Now, just to show one more particular example here, let's say that once we take this, I'm going to go to the Home tab. And now let's go ahead and kind of put some fill inside there to make it look a little bit better. And so now let's go ahead and Bob's. Now let's say that at one point I wanted the text to turn red. So quite often when numbers are negative or if they get above a certain threshold, you want them to change. But watch what we can do. We can go to this particular label right here. I can go down and it has a color property. So there's a hard-coded color. Instead, what we're going to do, we're going to say if, and now I'll say something such as, I'll look at that text box and we'll look at the text property and we'll basically see, what is the length, of the text property inside there. So as we are able to, get the len of the text property, if that is greater than 10, I want to show the color as red, and if not, I want to show the color as something else, which is going to be in this case blue. Okay. Also know that some of these colors you don't even have to put in quotes, because they're understood by the formula language inside here. Okay, so now it's blue up to a certain point, and then I type more and more characters, and it turns red. So the whole idea that this input control doesn't have any outside parties that are influencing it. It has expressions or formulas for properties that know how to update itself. So seeing that gets to be, one of the really big parts about, understanding Power Apps and starting to go with the flow as you start building things. Okay, now the first thing I showed you was working with screens and controls. So the screen represents the atomic unit of UI design. So quite often you'll have a screen to show all the customers and then a second screen to view a specific customer and another screen to edit a customer. Quite often we can create one edit screen and use it for both new records and updating existing records inside there. Okay. Now, I showed you, how we get started with interactivity, and I kind of showed you the properties panel and how to work with formulas. Now, there are quite a few, different types of controls that we can add. Some that hold text, some that are things like date pickers, drop-down lists, galleries. There's a data table we're going to look at in just a second. Media, charts. So it takes a while just to, be able to play with each and every control that comes out of the box. Now, the next thing we want to address is forms. Now, before I get further into forms, let's go ahead and do another demo. Okay, turns out that I don't really care about what I just did right here. So what I'm going to do is we're going to leave, and we're going to go to a different location. In fact, I'm going to go to my OneDrive site right here. Now, inside of my OneDrive site, I've created this little Excel workbook. And this Excel workbook has a single worksheet, and it has a single table defined inside there. So here it is. It's called expense data. Let's go ahead and open this up. So what I want to do is I want to build a Power App on top of this Excel workbook, because as I track expenses, I basically want to be able to track them, as we buy things inside there. Okay, now what we're going to do is let's go back to Power Apps, and I'm going to say create a new app. Now, as I create this new app, one of my options is to start with OneDrive. And this app template that I'm about to use pretty much, means that you have an Excel workbook or some other supported type of data inside there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OneDrive for Business, and let's create a phone layout. Power Apps will now go and look at my OneDrive for Business scenario, and pick and show me the different workbooks that are in there. I'll go ahead and pick this workbook. And so as I do that, it basically shows me all the different tables it finds in the various worksheets inside that workbook. And there's one, expenses. So I'm going to click this, and we're going to go ahead and choose Connect. Now, when I do, it saw that there is a data source. So there's this very common pattern where it builds 3 screens for me. So you can see that there is the browse screen inside there. Okay, great. There is the detail screen inside there. There is the edit screen. Okay, now before we do any rebuilding, let's just go ahead and test the app real quick. So if I go back here, I can kind of see that I've got a couple different expenses inside there. Let's go ahead and create a new item. So let's say that we had this. We have a particular category inside there, which is office supplies. It is what is the date. Now we're going to have to work on this calendar table a little bit to make it a little bit easier to work with. But then, what is the expense? It is paper clips inside here. Let's go ahead and click on Enter. Yeah, and what you see is that it's functional enough where it has just entered data inside there. In fact, if I go back to that workbook and I go ahead and I refresh the workbook, we should see that, hey, there's the, data that I just added inside there. Okay, now let's go back and do a little bit more work with this. And in particular, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the edit screen and the browse screen. Why don't we start with the browse screen? So what you'll see here is that if I open up the browse screen, there is something which is called a gallery. So galleries are typically used when we want to show multiple items at one time. But if I go ahead and I'm going to choose the view menu and I'm going to pull this thing out, which is the data panel, note that if I now see that I'm using expenses as a connection, and if I go down and click inside there, I can see that there are these different layouts. So the idea of forms is that you're working with some data source that's giving you relational data, one or more rows of data. And the idea is that we know that the data has a certain number of columns, and there's different layouts that we can have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch this to title, subtitle, and body. And when I do that, what do I want in each of these things? What should be inside of the title? So I'll go ahead and I'll switch that to the actual expense, which is the text-based name. And then second thing we'll have is, what is the category? And then the third thing we're going to have is, what is the amount inside here? Okay, now I've got the amount. If I need to go to the Home tab, there's all kinds of things here where I could take the font size and, we can bounce it up a little bit. Great. Let's also go to the text property here. So if I go to the text property, what I want to do is I want to format this so it looks like currency. Now, currently, it has this item dot amount. So the idea is that you have a template, and so every instance of this template, has one of the expenses inside there. So this gives me the amount, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a property which is called text. And the idea, very much like Excel, is that when I call this property, I can also pass a formatting code. So if I say $pound, comma, pound, .00, I now have my particular formula inside there. And once again, we could also do something such as, go to color. Let's go back here and we'll take color. And so, what we'll basically say is we'll create a if statement. And the if statement is, what is the amount? So note that when you're working inside, of a form, the columns are just available to you. So if the amount is greater than $100, let's go ahead and show that as red. If not, we'll show it as black and go ahead and hit enter. Okay. And so now what we can do is we can kind of make things stick out inside there. Okay. Now that's the first form. That's the browse form. Let's go now to the edit form and open the edit form up. Now here, what you'll see is that we have an input form. So I'm going to go ahead once again, and the way I typically bring up the data panel is go to the view menu and click on data sources. This brings this panel up. And now watch what happens when I start clicking on the form. It basically says, what is the model that you want? So there is vertical, and you can see that the label is on top and the input control is underneath. If I switch that over to horizontal, basically makes the form a little easier to read, but it might not render as well on a mobile device. Okay, so let's go back to vertical. Now, let's say that I don't like this order right here. Now, you have these little controls that are called data cards inside here. And if I look over here at the fields list, note that each card I can basically just kind of move up and down within the actual form itself. So let's say that I want expense up, expense, then category, then date, and then amount. And it's pretty easy to move that around inside there. Okay, now currently, what you'll see is that category is just a regular old text box. I don't want that to be a regular old text box. I want that to be something like a combo box with allowed values. So let's go ahead and add that inside there. And so now that we've changed it to a combo box, the trick is to fill up the items collection. So I'm going to go down to where we have the items inside here, inside of this particular box right here. And note that at first, it's locked out. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to go to the Advanced tab and be able to unlock the data card so that you can make custom edits to it. Let's go ahead and click on that. Now that I've done that, I can go into items. And so what's going to be next here is something that's a little bit strange. So I have a square bracket, and let's just put X and Y and Z inside here. So what I want you to see here is that you have square brackets, and then you have items, and you're creating an array. So if our expenses, turned out to be office supplies, and then next we have operations, and we have marketing inside here. Let's go ahead and test it out. Just go ahead and run it and drop this down. And so you're basically creating this drop-down list inside there. Okay, now there's a lot of really neat things that the wizards in Power Apps do for you, but there's also some things it does to you. And so here's one of those cases where I just want a date. I don't want this time stuff. So it's a little bit of a hassle to get rid of this, especially when you're just starting out inside here. Once again, I'm going to bring down the data source list. I just like having the data panel around when I do this next piece inside here. But note that at first, you can't move anything around inside here. So once again, we'll go ahead and unlock. And now I can come back and I'm going to take this. I will delete it. I will take this piece. I will delete it. There's also a separator inside there that I left behind. So there are different ways that we can get rid of those. Now here you can kind of see that something has an invalid argument. So I just deleted the hour value and the minute value inside here. So I have to make sure that, with things like this, I basically clean things up, and now it seems to be clean. You can see that there's one more error inside there. So what is, the actual error? And so it was for the Y value. It was going to be those two items. I'll just go ahead and change that to 0. Okay, and now we'll take this last control and we'll expand it here inside. Okay, now I've done enough work with this just to kind of test things out. But now let's go back and take the entire application. And so I'm going to go into app settings. So let's say we've done enough where we want to actually publish this. So what is the name of my app? We'll just call it the expense manager inside there. We'll give it a nice color. We'll find one of these icons that we really like inside there. Note that under screen and orientation, you can switch back and forth between these. I'm just going to stick to the portrait so that it looks good on the iPhone. We'll go ahead, we'll choose Save inside here. And now that we have chosen Save, well, now do I want to share this app? So I could share the app with other people, but all I want to do now is let's kind of see a simple example of being able to work with this. Okay, so what I'm going to do for this next example is let's go ahead, and I have the ability here, if I can figure out how to do this, to connect to my iPhone inside here. And so now that I've connected to my iPhone, let's go ahead and kind of do a quick test drive. So one thing to note is that I have the PowerApps and the Flow mobile apps installed. So let's go ahead and fire up PowerApps. Now that I've fired that up, I can see the PowerApps that either I have built or others have made available to me. I'm going to go ahead and click on refresh. Hey, there's that expense manager that we just created inside there. Let's go ahead and click on the expense manager. So now what you're going to see is that I've gotten now this application, into the hands of some other folks. And so now someone adds a new expense. So what is the expense? We had another lunch. What is the, I guess it was marketing. What is the date? What I should have done is set a default date of today. But now we'll go ahead and we'll, add a new expense inside here. And now that we've done that, we'll go ahead and click on the check mark up top. And, what we should see is that, now I've created this new expense. It's working inside of my iPhone. We'll go back over here. We'll do a quick refresh. We've kind of done a round trip and kind of seen how someone can build an app, how someone can then save the app. If you save the app, you can automatically use it. If you save the app, you can also share it with others with edit permissions so that they can help you build it or copy it. And then you could also share the app for others, who are the intended users inside there. Okay, so what did we look at? We looked at starting to work with data. And what you'll see is that forms, are a really big part of that inside there. Okay, and it's not just the forms, but a form basically models a record. And when you connect to a data source and you pull back data, there are columns in whatever table that you have. So each card control, represents a single field, from that particular record. And you've kind of seen, how we're able to go through and change those inside there. So that's one of the first things you want to get the hang of, is working with cards and being able to, make multi-record views and single record views for either viewing or edit and inserting new records. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do is take a deeper look at working with connectors. Now, there's two important concepts: connectors and connections. So when you think of a connector, it's a piece of code that either someone at Microsoft has written or third parties have written. And the idea of a connector is it simply gives us a wrapper around an API so that when we use PowerApps and we use Flow, we can read and write from various data sources, such as SharePoint, SQL Server. And what's really nice is that Microsoft continues to, build up the number of connectors, but yet it doesn't really change the way that we build our applications. It's just basically different ways to get into different data sources. Now, there are lots of connectors that Microsoft has. You will also create connections. So the idea of a connection is that you will create a new configuration for one of the connectors, and you'll add things like the connection string to a particular database, and you'll add credentials, for what is the username and password when we connect to the database inside there. Now, connections, often have permissions that are associated with it. So to be able to use a connection, the Power App then will be reaching into a data source with someone's identity. And so quite often there's a need for Power Apps to communicate to a consumer. Oh, by the way, this app is going to connect to your Outlook inbox as you and can send messages. You need to go ahead and grant permissions, for that to be okay. Okay. We also saw the data panel inside there. So let's say that, let's build a, something new. So let's say I go back and we'll create a new Power App. And this time, when I build a Power App, let's start again with a blank form. And what I want to do is connect to a data source when we're not using one of the pre-canned templates. So let's build a new Power App from scratch and have it built based on the tablet layout, not the phone layout. So let's say that step number one, we want to see some data from SharePoint. If I go back to this SharePoint site right here, one of the things that if I go to site contents, do I have some data that I might want to get at? So notice that we have a customers list. Customers list has 2,000-3,000 customers inside there. So what we'd like to do is I'm going to go to the insert menu and I'm going to choose this new data table. Okay, I want to add some things into this data table. Well, this basically wants a data source. It doesn't have one yet. So over here, we're going to say add a data source. We'll say add a data source, and you can see there's SharePoint right there. So I'll go ahead and click. Now, I've already added my credentials to get to the SharePoint site, so it doesn't need to continually ask me to provide username and password inside there. Also, it should be able to reach out and figure out what SharePoint sites I have permissions to get to. So I'm going to pick that one site, and then here are customers inside. Let's go ahead and add customers, and let's go ahead and connect to that data source. Okay, so now that we've connected to that data source, what you can see is that here are all the underlying fields inside there. Well, there's a lot of fields in SharePoint. So let's go ahead and pick the ID field. Let's go ahead and pick the last name field. And in addition to the last name field, let's go ahead and find the first name field as well. And maybe one more, we'll go ahead and pick company. So notice that as it starts building, once again, you have the data cards. I want first name before last name. I can move that around. Nope, I want it back the other way. Okay. Also, as I move inside here, you can see that, there's little things that I can use to kind of move the columns around inside. Okay, so what you saw is that it's fairly easy for you to be able to connect, to these external data sources, SharePoint just being one of them. Now, the next thing that I want to look at is understanding something called delegation. So one of the things that they were obviously concerned about when they built Power Apps is what if you have a user that doesn't think about much and just connects to the 1 million record customers database and tries to bring all the customers, out of the database to some other place? That would not be good. So there is this idea that when connectors are created, they support delegation. And the idea of delegation is that I'm going to be able to write code using things like the filter, the lookup functions, and the Power Apps infrastructure can automatically figure out how to send a more efficient query back to the back end. Okay, sounds good, doesn't it? So let's go ahead and kind of put this to use inside here. So one of the things that you'll note is that even though there's several thousand customers, it's never going to bring back more than 500 at once. So let's go ahead and add a new text box in here. And we want this text box to be a search box inside here. Maybe down here under icons, I'll get a search icon. I'll make it a little bit smaller. And now we'll go ahead and put this up here. And now let's go ahead and take our data grid, move it around just a little bit inside here, our data table. So what I want to be able to do is I want to start typing the first couple characters of the last name, and I want someone to be able to find that inside there. So I'm going to go to the data table, and you can see that you have a items collection, and right now items is just being fed by customer. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a filter statement or a filter function inside there. So we'll call filter. And when you call filter, the first thing you need to do is say, what is the data source we want to filter? And then, what do we want to look at right here? So we want to look at something like the last name property. Now, what's weird about this demo is that I have a column which is based on the SharePoint title column, but yet it's been renamed to last name. So here it doesn't understand last name, it understands title instead. So we're going to use a function which is built in, which is starts with. And so if I say title, and the title in our case starts with, and then we've got that text input box. So let's basically say text input dot text. And so now that we've got this statement inside there, maybe we'll go to the text box and we'll have the default be A inside here. Okay, and so we'll give it a second, and what we should see here is that I've rewritten this incorrectly right here because I need one more closing paren. And then I put this inside here. And what we should see after a second, you can kind of see a couple dots in the background, so it's going and running another query inside here. But what we should be able to do, is be able to type inside here, and all of a sudden you kind of see that, hey, we're sorting, by the, or we're basically able to type in, VAR, and it automatically does the query in the background. So once again, being able to drive these inside here, let's go just a little bit further right here. One of the things that gets to be common is that you have these scenarios where they look for a customer and then they finally find the customer and they click on the customer. Okay, so what we're going to do here is let's go ahead and add a form. In this case, I'll just add a display form. And so when we add the display form, what's going to be the data source? And once again, we'll pick customer inside here. And now that we have done that, let's kind of put this over to the side. A couple quick changes here is let's go ahead and change it to one column at a time, and we won't show everything inside here. I'll just show selected things. So let me go ahead and get rid of some of the things inside here. All right. But now, if I can basically take this entire form And so notice that it has a data source, which is customers, but there is also a property which is called item. So now what we can do, and the idea is that the customer, which is basically a set of columns, becomes this object that's understood across these different controls. So for item, we're going to basically say, well, let's go back to our data table. And so if I go back to the data table that we've created, it has a property which is selected. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this up right here. Yeah, so now the idea is that I can start typing ahead. I can find a particular customer, and now when I click on that customer, we're bringing the customer information over here, on the right-hand side. Okay, so you can kind of see that gives you a pretty quick basis, for starting to quickly build applications, especially if they're not writing. If they're only doing lookups, this gets to be, very easy. I find, to me, most of the tricky stuff comes, when it's time to update data that you're pushing, back to the system inside there. Okay, so once again, just understanding what delegation is and understanding that most of the connectors that are built in, won't give you back more than 500 items at once. And so most of the data sources, well, some connectors support delegation, some do not. The two big ones, SharePoint and SQL Server, support delegation. And so the idea of delegation is that when you start writing, something, such as what we have here for the data table, when I'm using a filter function or a lookup function or a sort by columns function, it's able to translate that, into the SQL statements it sends to the back end. And that's the idea of delegation. Okay, so now we've seen delegation. We've kind of looked at building things for SharePoint Online. Note that there's two other things that they've done for SharePoint Online. And if I go to look at a particular list, so in our case right here, let's say that we have this expenses list. So now instead of having my data inside of an Excel workbook, I want to have the data, inside of a SharePoint list. Now, it turns out that I could go back and create a app from scratch, from blank, and add SharePoint and this list as a data source. But a second, easier way to do that would be to go into the SharePoint list that use the modern UI and choose Create an App. And so now we'll call this one App 123. And what you'll see is that it simply gives you a starting point for a new app. And just like my last demo, it's going to have the browse screen, the view screen, and the edit screen. And it's going to give you a quick mobile-friendly way, for users to be able to see what's inside there. Now, if I look back at the SharePoint site as this is being built, and we go ahead and we look at the customers list inside here, and then I click on new, as if I were to add a new customer. No, I'm sorry. Let me take that back. It's the expenses list that we're working with. But let's go ahead and click on new. So I wanted to show you that, first of all, in SharePoint, we have a choice column. So you can kind of set up a list of columns. You can have attachments. Now, let's go back to this particular list that we're creating inside here. Excuse me. It's the same thing where I can go to this data source and note that it's giving me these three things, the body, subtitle, but now it's using these weird SharePoint fields with no data to fill the other pieces inside here. So for the title, let's go ahead and actually use the title inside there, which is in our case the expense description inside there. For the subtitle, we'll go ahead and we will use the expense category inside there. And once we've got the expense category inside there, the last thing, well, I'll put the expense date, and then we'll put the price inside the last one. But you're able to see that we're able to quickly move these things around and do the same type of formatting. Now, in this case right here, if I go and we take a look at the edit screen, what you can see is it was able to kind of list the fields in the same order that SharePoint site had them. It's already, worked out the expense category. And if I go down and we take a look at this and we look at items, you can basically see that it's able to get the expense category and build choices out of that inside there. So it's able to work that out. And probably the only thing I'm really concerned about doing is getting rid of some of these fields down below. I could come here, I could click them to get rid of them. Also remember that you can bring up the data sources panel, and then as you click on this, there's just fields that you could uncheck to get rid of inside. Okay, and now I have something that I can push out to a mobile device that you can access from SharePoint. Now, one other thing that we have in SharePoint that is new as of this fall, so I guess maybe it's not all that new, is that if I go to an existing expense and I bring it up in edit, we basically have this out-of-the-box SharePoint editing experience in the new user interface. Now, let's say I don't like that particular user experience. I want to replace it. And so that's something that PowerApps can do easily for us. So PowerApps is basically taking over the role of InfoPath in being the go-to source for creating a customized user experience in any type of a view or edit or new item experience. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here, and with this particular app inside here, I'm going to drill down PowerApps, and we have customized forms. So let's go ahead and click on OK. Now, one thing that's still a little bit of a pain about working with this in SharePoint is the fact that they take a while to load. So when you load something in, they still have a 5 to 10 second load time, which a lot of people are agonizing about, kind of questioning, whether they're useful. But what we can see here is, okay, it starts out with a white screen. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and kind of just change that so we know it's going to be us inside there. We'll have this really pleasant color inside here. For good measure, let's go ahead and say I want to have a new screen inside here. So we'll go ahead and add a second screen. Okay, on my first screen inside here, let's take everything that we have here and push it down just a bit. So now I can add a button inside here. So let's go ahead and add my button. And so in this particular button, we will then navigate, to our other screen, which in our case is called screen 1 inside here. Okay, great. And now let's go to our other screen, and we'll just put a back button inside here. Now I know that, you will start inside of screen 1, so I know I can truly use the back button for this guy inside there. Okay, and now that I have that, let's just go ahead and use the back. Okay, so now that we've done that inside there, let's just go back and say File, Save. And note it's got the SharePoint list path inside. So the PowerApps people have been working with the SharePoint people to basically create the Power App and then install it inside of SharePoint. Let's go ahead and click Publish to SharePoint. And now that we've clicked on Publish to SharePoint, what we should see is this new experience. So let's go back here. Just to be sure, I'll do a refresh on this particular page right here. And once we have done the refresh on the page, let's go ahead and see what things are going to look like. I'll come down here. I'll go into Edit. Now you can kind of see it's taking a second to start up, but now, what we're able to do is kind of, get back and forth if I wanted to kind of fill things out inside there, but if you have such tricky stuff, that you want to have several different pages, or you want to have something where you're doing lookups from web services or any of the other things that PowerApps and Flow can do to kind of help the user, to build out the SharePoint item, you can see that there's a lot of things that, a lot of scenarios come to mind as you start thinking about, what you can do with this inside there. Okay. So now that we've seen that, we've kind of seen how SharePoint lists work and how you can edit. The last topic we're going to get into is working with Microsoft Flow. Now, the idea of Microsoft Flow is that it allows you to build a processing pipeline, or what we kind of think of as an automated workflow. Take some type of business process and figure out how we can automate it. So with Microsoft Flow, you're going to build flows. If you want to think of them as workflows, kind of coming over from SharePoint Designer workflows, that's fine as you get started. But flows are these individual building blocks that we create and save, and then we can use in PowerApps or use them by themselves. Maybe I want to copy files. Maybe I want to collect data. Now, when we start working with Flow, one of the things that we can do is we can start building flows that get triggered by things like SharePoint events, someone creating a new event, or a new device order, something like that. Now, every flow needs a trigger. What starts it running? And sometimes I create a button, someone clicks on the button, and that's the trigger that starts a flow running. I could create a flow based on an HTTP request, and so then anytime someone hit this one particular HTTP endpoint that I gave them, my flow starts running with any other information they sent inside there. Now, once we create a flow, we're going to start adding actions and conditions inside there. Okay. For instance, let's say that we go back to this expense list, and I can create a flow from here. But instead of creating a flow from there, let's go ahead and I'm going to go over to the entry point, which is flow.microsoft.com. And when you navigate there, they usually put some type of a language identifier, or in my case, we have US in front. So let's say that I want to create a flow. And so what we'll do is we'll basically say create from blank. Now, if you create a flow from blank, you need a trigger. Now, there's all kinds of templates that you can get that predefine what the trigger is and what the actions are. Since I don't have much time, I want to build something from scratch. So what we want to do is we want to have a trigger when a new item is created inside of SharePoint. Now, when we create this right here, what you're going to see is that in our case, we have something here where we get to pick a site. Once we've picked a site, we get to pick what is the list. So let's say every time someone adds a new expense, I want to go ahead and do something. So let's go ahead and add a new step. So the idea is that when someone adds a new expense to that SharePoint list, this flow will begin to run. Now, one of the nice things is that I'm going to start adding actions and conditions, but this first trigger has already added data, into the flow. And as we start flowing, as it were, from one step to another, the data typically gets, larger and larger. So let's add a condition. So what is my condition? And so let's say that I want to look down here and we have a expense amount. If the expense amount is and greater than, and let's say, $250, well, what would we like to do? I'd like to go ahead and add an action. Now, I can add a yes action and a no action. Sometimes you just want to add one or the other. So in this case, let's go ahead and add an action. So what I'd like to do, is I'd like to go ahead and email. So what we'll do is we will find the one which is send me an email notification. Okay. Now, if I basically just say send me an email with options, I can put anything inside there. What's nice about notifications is that I'll get a ding on my phone when this thing comes in. Now, in our case right here, I'm just going to use a simple one, send email. Now, who are we going to send this to? So what you'll notice is that there's all kinds of detail over here, over on the right, about what you can get inside there, modified by email. So if I'm the one that modified it, it's going to send the email to me. And so we're going to say something like check out expense for. And so what I can now do is we can find something like the expense amount, and we can add that, inside of our email. I can start building out the body, putting all kinds of text inside here, and then I can start adding in, other details. What was the date? What was the category amount? What was the expense description inside here? Okay, and so now what we're going to do is let's go ahead and save it. So up top here, when you're all done, you don't want to leave it untitled. So we're going to say something like email big expenses. And so once we've got this in place, there's really not much for me to do, because it's put a trigger in place so that whenever someone comes and enters something inside there, we're going to be able to see it. Now, let's go back here in Flow. And what we can do is we can basically look at the run history. Now, let's go back and let's add a new expense inside here. And so I should have worked a little harder. This is the expense X, Y, Z inside there. What is the expense category? Marketing. What is the expense date inside there? Okay. And so let's say that for this first one, let's put it under 200. So we'll do 2. So we'll go ahead and click on this one. And, now that we have saved, that is number 1. And now let's do a second expense. This one is the ABC expense. We'll put it in the expense category. We'll put a date in place inside here. And then finally, this expense amount, will be $450. And we'll go ahead and hit save. And so now that we've done that, let's go back and take a look at our flow. And what we should be able to see is, did my flow run? Yes, we can see that 2 flows ran. So whether it sent an email or not, the flow still had to run. So if I look at the first one inside here, what we should be able to see here when this finally comes up is that I can kind of see what happened inside there. And we, if yes, send an email, the expression value, equals false inside there. So basically errored on the no side. If we now go back and we kind of take a look at the other one inside, and we kind of look at send an email inside, you can kind of see what it sent. And then finally, if I now go back and I take a look at my inbox, I should be able to confirm, that I indeed do have that particular email message that's been sent to me. Okay. Now, one more thing that I want to show here is kind of running out of time, but there's one more thing I want to show you. So let's go back to Power Apps. And there's this one Power App which is called the Photo Bomber. I'm going to go ahead and open this inside there. And the idea of the Photo Bomber here is that I wanted kind of a quick way to be able to take pictures on my iPhone. Oh, there's me. Hello there. And the idea with this is I have the camera control. And when we click on the camera control, there's an image control where we basically take an image. And if everything looks great, we should be able to then kind of upload something to SharePoint inside here. Now, the way it works is that we have a camera control inside. Also note that if I look at the screen, a screen has something which is the on start. And so here's a little trick where I want to set a variable. So I'm going to say set file count equal to 1. Okay, now each time we click on this camera, what's going to happen? So I look at the camera, and the camera has on select. And so we're basically going to take the camera's photo and basically save it off to that particular my photo variable. And then down here, I just have an image control that looks at the last photo I saved to that variable. Now, when it's time to upload to SharePoint, that's where we have to get Flow involved. So I look at actions, and we look at the flows that we have inside here. And what you're going to see is that there is this flow which is called Save Photo to SharePoint. Now, if we go ahead and we take a look at that particular flow, let's move back over here. What's going to happen is there is this image that we have. And so with the image, there is some transformation that we have to do. So I'm going to take this, and inside of this flow, I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit. And so what you'll see is that there is a special trigger called PowerApps. And when we use this particular flow, and we come in and we have different things inside, there is this one parameter that you can ask called Ask in PowerApps. And so that's how PowerApps can pass information. Now also, there is this need when the data comes in. What you're going to see here is the data comes in as with a format that doesn't work with the create file in SharePoint. So we go ahead and we use something which is called data URI to binary to convert the data, and then I can just use the SharePoint create file action inside there. Okay, now if I go back here to the SharePoint site, okay, I know we're a minute over. I think probably about 4 more minutes and we'll be able to wrap up. So for those of you who have things that are pressing, I think I can wrap up in 4 minutes. So what we'd like to do here is I'd like to go ahead and look at this one library that I have. So let's go down here, and I have a library, and down here it's called Photos. Okay, I got a whole bunch of photos inside here. In fact, these are really bad photos of mine inside here. And what I want to do is let's go ahead and get rid of them so we can basically put some more photos inside there. So with the Photo Bomber, which is this application, let's go ahead and move back to this. Okay, so back here on my iPhone now. Okay, and now let's go back into PowerApps. And as I get back into PowerApps here, there is the Photo Bomber that we have right here. Okay, so now what I'm able to do is just kind of walk around freely with my iPhone, looking at different things like these really interesting boxes. I go ahead and I click once, and then I click on a second time and upload to SharePoint, and then I kind of take a look at something else and click upload to SharePoint. But what you can see here is that I've kind of made it trivial, in this application, to be able to send something up into SharePoint. And with, very few clicks, what you can see here is, there is the, picture that I just took. And in 2 clicks, it went from my iPhone, up into SharePoint for safekeeping inside there. Okay. So we've looked at Flow, and Flow is a different beast, even though they work together. So what you'll find is that PowerApps has a formula language, and Flow has a completely different formula language. Flow is going to be trickier to use than PowerApps, so give yourself, reasonable expectations, for getting up to speed on those. Okay. Now, just to kind of quickly go through some of the other topics that we can't cover in an hour, the Common Data Service is a native data format for PowerApps Flow and Dynamics 365. So the whole idea is that we have pre-canned database tables for things like accounts, contacts, expenses. So while I don't really have time to get into the Common Data Service, you'll hear the team that's pushing PowerApps and Flow pushing the Common Data Service and wanting us, all to use that as one place that we can put our data. There's also topics, once you start getting good with PowerApps and Flow, how do you then use it in a large organization? So there's a PowerApps and Flow. There are admin centers for each one, and we're able to create these things that are called environments. And, one idea would be that we create environments, and we have environments for developing and testing, other environments for protection. Now, once you create an environment, you can basically do testing and development inside there, and you're totally isolated. And then there's a way to package what you've done and move it, into a production environment. But there's also a very important thing called data loss prevention policies. You've seen some really neat connectors, but not every company wants an employee to be able to shoot things off to Dropbox, especially companies with sensitive information. So environments can be configured to only allow certain types of connectors, so you're only getting out to, the data that, your apps should have access to. There's all kinds of application lifecycle management issues, as far as being able to share apps, being able to version apps, and, that's also something that you have to use. I guess the reason I quickly ran through this last section here is just to kind of promote our 2-day new deep dive into PowerApps and Flow course. So if you have any questions about that, we'd be happy to answer those. If you're able to take a look at that, we just want to have training like this last hour, but drilling down for 2 days and giving you plenty of hands-on labs, so you really feel like you get it under your fingertips. I think we're a little bit over, so I'm going to say thank you to all of you for joining us today, especially on Valentine's Day. Hopefully you now have a new acquired love for PowerApps and Flow. The next webinar we have 2 weeks from now is going to totally change the topic. We're switching from love to war, and it's called Programming M for the Power BI Warrior. So we'll have basically an advanced session on working in the advanced editor window and advanced M programming. So for now, thank you for coming, and hope to see you soon.